Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. In this episode, we speak with Justice Hampton, Director of Merchandising at WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Justice joined WPIC in March 2021, bringing with him 15 years of experience in merchandising. He previously held roles at a number of luxury apparel brands, including Lululemon, Abercrombie & Fitch, Coach, Ralph Lauren, and Club Monaco. We talked to Justice about how the world of merchandising has changed forever with the rise of the digital era, yet the fundamentals have remained unchanged. We discuss some companies who exemplify effective online merchandising and why. We discuss why it's such a difficult thing to master and what some of the emerging trends are, especially in China, that brands need to understand in order to be effective there, and what the future of merchandising looks like, both globally and in China. Enjoy.
One of the really cool things that certain online brands do really well is they take the best of what is the in-store experience and they figure out a way to replicate it as seamlessly as possible online. So when it comes to apparel, which is very much a, say, tactile art, right? Successful merchandising in the apparel space, it's visual, it's ambient, right? It's the music, it's the people in the store. It's feeling like you're a part of like this cool kind of secret club where you're finding like the best products. They almost kind of replicate the experience of going into a really cool shop and just talking with someone who works at the store, who's just really smart and savvy and just knows their class.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies.
Justice, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a bit of an introduction into yourself, the work you've done historically, as well as the work you are now going to be doing for WPIC.
So my background is in product merchandising. That's kind of how I cut my teeth in my professional career. I have worked for quite a few large apparel brands, and my passion has always been working really closely with creatives and working on really amazing products and creating the strategies that allow that amazing product to come to life in a really impactful way for the guest, whether that guest is interacting with our product in store or online. So that's kind of what my the meat of my career has been for the last, gosh, I don't even want to say, I feel so old, for quite some time. We'll leave it at that. So my role at WPIC is really to leverage that rich history of both qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis, working with amazing products, and to make sure that whatever that client, whatever their product story is, whatever they're best in class at, to make sure that translates as seamlessly as possible from North America, Europe, wherever they're coming from, to that Chinese guest. You know, that's kind of my reason for being is at WPIC.
This is probably, I'm front loading my favorite question, because when I think about merchandising, I think about my background in the old days of working with Coca-Cola and going from store to store to store, checking on product, negotiating shelf space, and, at the front of the store, and redoing the displays and, like all that kind of stuff. To me, that was merchandising, right? Was the brick and mortar version of it. But now everything's digital, right? So much shopping is done online. So, talk to us generally. What is this new world of merchandising like for e-commerce in this digital age?
Yeah, it's a really exciting time, I think, to be a merchant. I mean, to be honest, merchandising is a pretty exciting job all the time. There's always something kind of cool and new happening. I think what's really exciting right now for me, and what's also kind of gratifying given my background and my experience, is that, merchandising has changed quite a bit as everything has become more e-commerce driven, more digital, more online, having more points of contact with the guest outside of a traditional brick and mortar format. What I find to be really gratifying is that despite all those changes, I think what makes a really strong merchandising strategy, what makes a really strong product strategy, I think a lot of those things are the same. It's just being able to use that kind of digital component and that kind of like using the technology to be able to amplify the things that you were doing at the brick and mortar level. And now you just have all these more amazing ways to kind of, accentuate what your product story is and really meet the guests where they are on multiple platforms, right? So I think in terms of what's new and exciting about that is I think the online merchandising has allowed, essentially the barrier to entry is a lot lower, right? So you're able to get the guest. It's a great time to be a guest, right? Because you're having that much more obviously access to all different types of products, right? The barrier of entry to find what you're looking for is a lot a lot lower. And you just have the opportunity just to find anything you need whenever you want it. How that impacts the merchandising side is it basically means that you've got to be a lot sharper at every point of contact, because essentially it's not one of those things where, like, if I'm trying to buy a shirt and I have my favorite kind of haberdasher that I go to, and I'm kind of like a captive audience, right? If I go in there, you may not have exactly what I want, but I'm already there. So I'm going to go ahead and do my shopping anyway, pick up what I need, because I don't want to sacrifice the time of having to go somewhere else. So online, right? Like, you have to be so much sharper at the point of sale, so much sharper at the point of like acquisition, getting the guests on the site, converting, because they don't have to, there's no inconvenience for them just to literally open a new browser tab, right? So I think what's really exciting now about the form of merchandising you have to be really good at in order to be successful online is that you need to be that much sharper, and your ability to hook the guest has to be that much more like evident, right? You have way less time to get the guest to be super in love with your brand. So I think that's kind of, in a nutshell, like, to me, that's like the really exciting part, is it basically forces everyone to kind of step their level of performance up in terms of how they interact with the guest. And that ends up, I think ultimately the guest ends up benefiting, right? Because they have a lot more options in terms of the products they're looking for. But I also think it has a positive benefit also for on the business side as well, because you get to learn a lot more quickly about what you're doing and is it working or not. You get to learn really in real time, which is another kind of exciting thing about, online merchandising.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what your day-to-day looks like? Because, again, as the guy who drove around in a Coke truck, trying to now visualize, well, now you're merchandising in a digital form, almost as a consultant, especially, being able to do it in other countries. What does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, my day-to-day has definitely changed a lot more, interfacing because this is business to business, right? So there's a lot more interaction with the client, whereas in a traditional kind of brick and mortar, like a vertical setup, I am the client. I manage my business. I create all the strategy. So like everything is done internally, whereas here there's a lot more daily hopping on a phone call to call a client, making sure that they feel like they're getting what they need from me, not only just me in terms of my function within the company, but at the end of the day, if you're a client reaching out to someone at WPIC, you may have all kinds of other questions that may not necessarily relate to my kind of narrow work view, but just I'm the representative, so now I got to answer other questions that for other people on our engagements team. So that's one way that's changed. So a lot more just kind of client calls, just checking in. Hey, like, are you getting what you need? Hey, I sent you an email a couple of days ago. I want to make sure we're keeping the ball moving on things. And the biggest difference really in my day to day, I am a very assiduous list maker, right? So my list gets a lot longer now because, I'm doing this for multiple accounts, right? So I think that's the other thing that's been different too. I spent a lot more time kind of like creating a system where I can easily, whether it's, writing it down on paper or checking in Excel or a Word document where it's like, hey, like, here's where each client is, like, here's who they are, here's where they are on the journey line, like, here's how I'm helping them, here's what's being held up. Like, there's a lot more of that kind of note taking that's happening in my day-to-day here, which is kind of like a bit of a switch kind of turning, because it's not so much about checking on things that I'm just doing for myself. It's checking on things that I'm doing for the client, right? So that just becomes a lot more back and forth.
In order to help our audience visualize what really good digital, and I'm keep calling it digital merchandising, because we call it online merchandising, but to help them visualize what really good online merchandising looks like, could we potentially call out a couple of global companies who really do online merchandising really well, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm an apparel guy, right? So I tend to spend a lot of time on apparel sites. And I would say a really great example of digital merchandising done incredibly well is Mr. Porter. I don't know if you've checked out. So Mr. Porter is it's the partner website to Net-a-Porter, which is a women's wear website. And then Mr. Porter is kind of like the menswear counterpart to that. I think if I can just take an aside here, I think one of the really cool things that certain online brands do really well is they take the best of what is the in-store experience and they figure out a way to replicate it as seamlessly as possible online. So when it comes to apparel, which is very much it's a tactile art, right? Successful merchandising in the apparel space, it's visual, it's tactile, it's being able to, it's ambient, right? It's the music, it's the people in the store, it's feeling like you're a part of like this cool kind of secret club and where you're finding like the best product. And like Mr. Porter does an amazing job of replicating that experience online. And the ways that they do that is, in my mind, they almost kind of replicate the experience of going into a really cool shop and just talking with someone who works at the store, who's just really smart and savvy and just knows their craft, right? So you can go into Mr. Porter, you'll find journals, you'll find articles, you'll find blog posts about, trends in men's, not only men's apparel, men's grooming, social issues, music, everything, right? So to me, it would be like, if you walk into my store and you're looking for a really great pair of jeans and there's a song on that you like you may ask me, what's that song? And I'm not going to tell you, oh, it's this band. Like if I'm really want to provide that grade A customer service, I'm going to tell you the band. I'm going to tell you the kind of music it is. I'm going to tell you why it's amazing. I'm going to figure out all these ways to create an experience for you that goes beyond just buying the clothing and leaving the store. And that's how you keep repeat customers. So I think Mr. Porter does a really great job of creating that experience of being in a store, but doing it in a way that's super convenient. It's very slick. It's just an amazing user experience for me. That's probably my favorite one. Another one is Essence. They're another retail brand that, again, just does a really great job of creating this very cool, atmospheric space where it's not just about coming onto the website, buying a pair of jeans, and then getting the heck out of it. Like they actually try to create and curate an experience for you. So those are two that I really love. I think if I needed to go outside of apparel, I really appreciate Apple. I appreciate the way that they showcase product. I appreciate the way that they really hone in on not only like the amazing features of their product, but also just the reason for making it, right? Like that really amazing intersection of kind of like the art and the science that leads to their product, I think is, I think probably best in class. It's pretty high up there for me. Those are like a few of my favorite brands. But for me, again, I think the common, like the bright red thread kind of tying those three sites together is that they do an amazing job of curating an experience that's beyond just showing up, buying something, and then leaving. I think that's really important.
Why is that seemingly hard to do? Why do so few companies get that right?
I think I think there's a couple of things that readily jump to mind. One, I think, if you got into a time machine and went back, 10, 15 years and looked at websites, or actually maybe not even that far, let's call it 8 or 9 years ago, there were some websites that were amazing, and there were a lot of websites that were just terrible. I think what's happened is, as these platforms have become more democratized, I think the actual guest experience has actually flattened. I think you kind of have to go out of your way to find a really subpar online experience, and one that sticks out as being an outlier. I think in general they're all at about the same level. So I think what's happened is, I think, first of all, it costs money and effort and time, right? So ultimately, if you're one of the great things about being online is you have less overhead, right? So if you want to create that amazing experience like a Mr. Porter or an Essence or an Apple, you got to pay people and you got to have the right platform. You got to spend a bit more money, right? So I think some brands just take the more expeditious route and say, well, if the experience is going to be about the same at our competitor's website, then as long as we're at that same level, that same baseline, we don't really have to spend more or pay people more to kind of get to that next level up, right? They may not see the reward in that. I think so. Part of it, I think, is just an economic, right? Just economic bottom line. Is it worth the spend? I think the other thing too is that it's not incredibly easy to get it right without the rest of that atmospheric, kind of the add-ons, the accoutrement that you're kind of adding in to create that amazing experience. It's a delicate balance because you don't want it to be so much that it's taking away from the product too, right? I think if there's this very delicate balance that I think it just takes a lot of time and effort. So when you combine that second element with the fact you have to spend money to kind of get it right, I can understand why for some brands, you know what, we're going to show up the same way as our competitors. That ticks that box. And the way we're going to win is by, the direct marketing, email blasts, right? Having inventory, being seamless in the way that we can service our demand from multiple DCs and things like that. I think they'd rather spend the money on those items because they feel like they're going to get a more immediate, return on investment.
And I because you're almost pointing to class and subtleness and the importance of it. I mean, you want to go in and have a great experience, but you almost don't want to know and have it ostensibly thrown in your face that we're trying to make a great experience for you. It makes me think of walking onto a car lot, going to buy a car where they get, where there's just balloons and sale signs everywhere and everything is at the front and the sales guys run over and they're super aggressive with you versus a little bit of a more laid back, a little more clean. Can we get you a coffee? Something you can walk around, you get everything that you need and nothing that you don't. And it didn't feel like you were being sold something and that you were the master of your own domain the entire time you were there, making all of your own decisions, but you were left with this really pleasant feeling. That to me is a great segue into really where we want to take this conversation is to talk about China. Let's start with trends you're seeing in merchandising globally. Okay, so outside of our North American bubble, and then how that translates and how that differs into the China ecosystem.
Sure. I think, and again, as I am getting more accustomed with that guest and with this particular role, a few things that kind of stick out in my mind. One is just how important the KOL part of the business is. That is something that you have visibility to it. You have a certain level of visibility to it in a traditional North American kind of brick and mortar vertical merch setup. But just understanding just the approach in the Chinese market, it's so much more, I think, aggressive, and it's an absolute need to have. So I think, understanding just how that Chinese guest interacts with the KOL people in a different way, I think, than it does in North America. I think it's been a really interesting kind of like opening lesson for me. Because I honestly, like, there are plenty of brands, and they may not be huge, maybe they're smaller, they're more, boutique, that can sell amazing products that don't necessarily, they have a digital presence, right? But they're not necessarily, doing the KOL route, right? It's like there's ways to exist in that ecosystem in the United States without having to lean on KOLs as much. So that's been one thing that's a really big difference to me. I think also too, just like because the Chinese guest is starting to get more exposure to these North American and kind of in European brands.
When you say guest, I just have to clarify something. Does that consumer who has kind of landed on your site type of?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that comes from my background in my lab organization, where saying the word customer was like a dirty word. It was always the guest. I think I've just drank the Kool-Aid for a couple of years. But yeah, guest and customer, I probably use those interchangeably.
I'm not a bellboy. I'm guest services.
Yeah. That's right. Or you're a concierge.
Correct.
No, I think, it's just interesting how the guests actually what I wanted to say, what's interesting is that how the guest actually interacts with, like, using Tmall as an example. One of the big eye openers for me is that the guest going on Tmall isn't necessarily going on Tmall like on their phone, right? To get what they want and just get out of there. Like, they're actually using Tmall and their phone as a way to, like, pass the time, which is because what's interesting to me, I know it's not the same thing, but it makes me think about how in like a brick and mortar merchandising, like, the idea is to keep the guest in the store, right? You put the right product in the right inventory levels in front of them. You crank the dollar per square foot up. You crank like the units per transaction, all that stuff. You get all those things humming by keeping the guest in the store for as long as possible. Whereas I think, e-com, it's really about, getting the guest in, giving them enough content they need to make the transaction and get out of there. You don't want them to feel like they're being kind of bogged down. So that's another thing that's different too, is that the guest, as I'm learning, the guest in China is actually spending quite a bit of time on Tmall to actually just kind of spend the time, do their shopping, but also it's almost like not a hobby, but it's almost like something to do, which is also kind of a bit of a switch.
It's like going to the mall.
Yeah, basically, it's exactly what it's like doing. But your mall's in the palm of your hand, so that's something that's also a bit of a change for me. Trying to think what else has like been kind of sticking out to me in terms of merchandising as I've been in seats so far.
Well, the design of their sites. Yeah. I mean, tell me if things have changed in the last, 5 years or 4.5 years since I left. But let's just say there wasn't a crafty use of white space to create elegance. It was a very different type of experience.
You're absolutely right. It feels very, I don't want to say claustrophobic in like, it's not a negative sense. It's just that, like, let's say highly efficient, right? Like, it's a lot of products. So if you go and do a product search for, whiskey tumblers, my gosh, you're going to see the range of products, the amount that they're jamming in. I think there was something, I was actually doing some research for one client, and I remember, I can't remember which product category it was, but I remember there were 85 pages of products that I got to look through to kind of understand like what the price ranging was, right? So it just visually, it looks so different from what I'm accustomed to, obviously, with that kind of more like North American, more Western kind of sensibility. So that's another thing where I'm kind of trying to break down that barrier too. And like, I feel a lot more comfortable navigating Tmall now than I did, 6-7 weeks ago. But it's still a bit of an adjustment.
Yeah. Well, and that's really the important part of why it's, we often repeat on this podcast the value of going into those foreign markets,
with trusted partners who've been there, done that, and know what it's like, because it is vastly different. And what you think is nice and elegant and kind of attractive can be very, very much not to another viewer, another guest. So let's talk a little bit about the future of merchandising. Let's lean in on the future of merchandising as you know it globally, and then let's tap into a little bit about your focus going forward in the new role, which is China. How will it differ in China versus the rest of the world in your kind of brief time so far?
So regarding the future of merchandising, I think what's going to happen is, what you're already seeing it, is that brands are getting smarter and smarter about the way that they are interacting with their guests. Obviously, you look at, perfect example, look at Instagram, 5 years ago versus what Instagram is now. Instagram is transformed into a marketplace, right? Which was initially just a place to share photos and, chat with your friends, right? So I think, for every, you can make the same argument with Snapchat, right? I think every new kind of social media platform, TikTok obviously is another, like, the more recent example. Every single one of these that comes out, merchandising, digital marketing, all that stuff is going to figure out a way to monetize that and sell something to whoever it is that's using those platforms. So that's just going to continue to accelerate. I also see online merchandising companies having a lot more flexibility in the way they price product, being able to kind of pivot between different kind of promotional strategies in a way that's very seamless, to where the guest actually feels like they're kind of getting the value that they want when they want it. I think that's going to happen. I imagine basically a scenario where a guest goes on to a website where they're accessing it through mobile, or they're on their phone, and that basically the company or the organization has a few different price scenarios already loaded up, and they've already worked that into their margin and into their cost, where basically the guest can almost select like which price they want to take advantage of, which gives the guest choice, but is also, at the end of the day, as long as you're planning for it and marketing and planning your margins appropriately, you're able to give that guest the that freedom of choice to pick what they want to spend, but you're still making what your margin is anyway. And I think of I think of websites like Honey, right? That kind of go and they kind of write. I think that's going to be kind of the next progression of that. I think you're going to see companies have a lot more flexibility in how they're promoting their prices and how they're giving the guest the opportunity to kind of pick what they want to spend. I feel like that's coming. And yeah, I mean, I also obviously continue to see, I'm curious to see how that barrier to entry, the low barrier to entry in terms of online, how that continues to get even easier for more and more companies and more brands to kind of continue kind of showing up. I think that's something that's kind of interesting to watch as well. So that's just kind of merchandising in general. I think as far as like merchandising in China, that's one where my line is a little more, if you were just thinking of my kind of newness in the field. I think as more and more brands, more and more non kind of native Chinese brands come into China, I think there's going to be an actual interesting tension between the kind of more localized brands and the way that they approach pricing, the way that they approach merchandising. I think you're going to start seeing a lot more of a Western influence in there, because I think China, if you're a Chinese brand, you have a competitive advantage in that you can obviously price lower, right, than a Western brand coming in, because the majority of the product is coming right out of your backyard. However, as the guest continues to get more and more exposure, which they already have, to these luxury brands, I think that you are going to see somewhat of an inflection point where I think brands that can show up and have a really, really solid like value proposition, like, yes, like we are asking you to spend more, but look at the quality that you're getting. I think eventually, guests kind of get tired of spending, $1.50, $2 or something that if they spend like an extra 10 or 15, it's going to last longer and they don't have to end up replacing it, right? I think that's going to happen too. I think you're going to see a lot more of that kind of like low price pressure. I think I would hope to see some of that ease as these really, really high end aspirational brands start to have more influence in China.
I agree. It will be. I think there will definitely be some influence, and I think there will be some. They'll each start kind of trending towards each other, and then you'll start to see this kind of interesting Venn diagram. But it also depends on. I think there's always been this Western perception of higher quality, a little bit more luxury that comes from outside China. But there's been a lot of inroads by local companies that have now been able to challenge on quality and luxury positioning. And but then the opportunity, vice versa, has been for a lot of Western brands to come in and actually compete at the lower price point entry points of some of the different markets and SKUs that are out there as well. So it's a constantly changing landscape, which is why we need people on quote unquote on the ground, although now it's digitally as well, in China. Which, leads me to my last kind of question in here is why did WPIC open up merchandising capabilities, for all the services and everything that they do to help all the brands be successful in China? And we know about Creative Labs that was just announced, and we talked to Charles about why that was important. Now we're talking about merchandising capabilities. Why is that also important?
Well, I mean, again, I think it goes back to being able to localize, right? You can localize a brand by having the right brand look that's appropriate for the country, having the right logos, having the right copy, having the right visual experience online, right? But you also have to localize the assortment. And so I think where the merchandising role comes in, which I think is a super exciting time to be a part of the organization in this capacity, is that it's an ability to get that much smarter about how you're deploying product in market, right? We spend a lot of time, assiduously putting together these data pools and understanding like what the size of market is, understanding how the market segments by price, by product category. What's really important is to make sure that as the client, if you're coming to WPIC for our expertise in market, you want to make sure that you have that level of guidance and care in making sure that whatever you're best in class at, doesn't matter what it is, are we forecasting the right amount of volume behind it based on what the data is telling us? So you could be as a perfect example, you could be a men's apparel company and you could do shirting, polos, suiting, amazing denim. But if you come into China with the wrong sizes or the wrong colors or the wrong pattern or the wrong kind of aspirational, what's the word I'm looking for? If you come into the market with like not the right kind of merchandising approach, you're not going to sell anything because it's a different guest. And so I think that's what a merchandising arm of any organization has to do, is to make sure that the product and the strategy and the data come together harmoniously to create an amazing product experience for the guest. That's exactly why the role is so important. And that's what I hope to bring to the organization in the role.
Justice Hampton, the new director of merchandising at WPIC, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Really great time. Thank you.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co, and be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见。